In 1934, during the depths of the Great Depression, when families were selling their children for the price of a meal and desperate souls lined up at auction blocks like cattle, one man's act of compassion would shatter every expectation in a small Texas town. What started as the most controversial purchase in Millfield's history would become the most talked-about transformation anyone had ever witnessed. This is not just a story about buying a child. It's about what happens when humanity triumphs over hardship, when love conquers poverty, and when one decision changes not just two lives, but an entire community forever. The dust had settled thick over Millfield, Texas, like a brown blanket that refused to lift. It was October 1934, and the Great Depression had squeezed the life out of most folks in town. Banks had closed their doors with iron padlocks, farms had turned to wastelands, and families were making choices that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. Sam Martinez walked slowly down the main street, his worn boots scraping against the wooden planks of the sidewalk. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, patched in several places where his wife Maria had carefully mended them. The 42-year-old rancher carried himself with dignity despite his circumstances, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he observed the town that had once been thriving. Sam's small ranch sat on the outskirts of Millfield, a modest spread of 30 acres that he had inherited from his father. The property had seen better days. The fences needed repair, the barn roof leaked in 3 places, and the well had been giving them trouble for months. Still, Sam and Maria managed to keep a few head of cattle and grow enough vegetables to feed themselves and have a little left over to sell or trade in town. Their neighbors often wondered how the Martinez family managed to stay afloat when so many others had lost everything. The secret lay in Sam's character. While other ranchers had taken on massive debts to expand their operations during the boom years, Sam had remained cautious. He believed in living within his means, saving what little he could, and never borrowing more than he could realistically pay back. This conservative approach had earned him some ridicule during the prosperous 1920s. Fellow ranchers called him "Careful Sam" or "Penny-pinching Martinez." They laughed at his old equipment and modest home while they built grand houses and bought expensive machinery on credit. Sam had endured their jokes with good humor, but Maria had sometimes felt embarrassed by their simple lifestyle. Now, as the Depression raged on, those same neighbors came to Sam with hat in hand. Some asked for loans they both knew would never be repaid. Others wanted to sell him their cattle, their land, or their equipment at prices far below what they had once been worth. Sam helped when he could, but his resources were limited. The Martinez family consisted of Sam, Maria, and their elderly dog, Rex. They had tried for years to have children, but it was not meant to be. Maria had suffered 3 miscarriages early in their marriage, and the doctor had eventually told them that having children was unlikely. This heartbreak had drawn them closer together, but it also left a hollow space in their home that they both felt acutely. On this particular October morning, Sam was heading to the town square where a crowd had gathered. Word had spread quickly through Millfield about what was happening at the courthouse steps. Families who could no longer feed their children were bringing them to be auctioned off to anyone who could provide for them. It was a practice that had become more common as the Depression deepened, though it remained deeply controversial and painful for everyone involved. The idea of auctioning children horrified Sam, but he understood the desperation that drove parents to such measures. He had seen families where parents had not eaten for days so their children could have a small portion of bread. He had witnessed mothers growing so thin they could barely stand while their babies cried from hunger. The auction was not about selling children like property. It was about finding them homes where they might survive. As Sam approached the courthouse, he could see the crowd that had assembled. There were perhaps 50 people present, a mix of curious onlookers and potential bidders. The bidders were easy to identify. They were the few residents of Millfield who still had steady income or some savings left. There was Dr. Harrison, who needed help with his medical practice and household. Mrs. Wheeler, the widow who owned the general store, was there with her sharp eyes scanning the children. Several farmers who had managed to keep their operations running stood near the front. The auctioneer was Judge Crawford, a thin man with grey hair who looked deeply uncomfortable with his role. In better times, Judge Crawford handled property disputes and minor criminal cases. These child auctions had become part of his duties by necessity, not choice. His voice carried across the square, but there was no enthusiasm in it, only resignation. The first child brought forward was a boy of perhaps 10 years old. His name was Tommy, and his parents stood to the side with tears streaming down their faces. The boy's father had lost his job at the lumber mill 6 months earlier, and they had sold everything they owned just to keep food on the table. Tommy was thin but alert, with intelligent eyes that darted nervously around the crowd. The bidding was subdued and respectful. Doctor. Harrison opened with an offer of $15, explaining that the boy could help with simple tasks around his office and home in exchange for room, board, and schooling. Wheeler countered with $20, stating that she needed help moving inventory and keeping her store organized. The final bid came from a farmer named Peterson, who offered $22.5 and promised that Tommy would be treated like family on his farm. Sam watched this process with growing unease. The adults were trying to be dignified about the situation, but the reality was heartbreaking. Children were being separated from their families, possibly forever, because there was simply not enough food to go around. He thought about his own comfortable childhood, when his biggest worry had been whether his father would let him ride the horses or help with the cattle roundup. The second child was a girl named Lucy, about 8 years old. She clutched a small rag doll and stayed close to her mother's side. Lucy's family had lost their farm to the bank, and her father had been unable to find work anywhere in the county. The girl was clearly frightened, and Sam noticed that she kept looking back at her mother as if checking to make sure she was still there. The bidding for Lucy was more competitive. Several families in town had expressed interest in having a girl who could help with household tasks and eventually learn useful skills like sewing and cooking. Sam noticed that the bidders seemed more focused on what the children could do for them rather than what they could do for the children. While their intentions might be good, the whole process felt wrong to him. Judge Crawford's voice grew even more strained as he called for the third child. Next we have Daniel, he announced, consulting his notes. Age approximately 7 years. Parents of the Morrison family. Sam looked toward the courthouse steps and felt his breath catch in his throat. The boy who stepped forward was so thin that his clothes seemed to hang on him like a scarecrow. Daniel's eyes were large in his gaunt face, and Sam could see the outline of his ribs through his worn shirt. The child's hair was unkempt, and his feet were bare, despite the cool October air. Behind Daniel, a woman who must have been his mother was openly weeping. She appeared to be in her early 30s, but hardship had aged her prematurely. Her husband stood beside her with his hands clenched into fists, staring at the ground. Sam could only imagine the agony these parents were experiencing. Judge Crawford cleared his throat and began describing Daniel's situation. The Morrison family had been sharecroppers on a large farm outside of town. When the farm owner lost his property to the bank, all the sharecropping families had been forced to leave. Daniel's father had found occasional work here and there, but it was not enough to feed the family consistently. They had been living in a tent on the outskirts of town for the past month. Daniel is a quiet boy, Judge Crawford continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He knows his letters and numbers. His mother says he's helpful and obedient. The family is asking for a minimum bid of $10 to ensure he goes to someone who can properly care for him. Sam looked around at the crowd and was disturbed by what he saw. The previous bidders were studying Daniel with calculating expressions, as if evaluating a piece of livestock. Doctor. Harrison was shaking his head. Apparently the boy looked too weak to be of much help in his practice. Mrs. Mulligan. Wheeler was whispering to the woman next to her, and Sam caught fragments of their conversation about how much it would cost to fatten him up before he could be useful. The farmer Peterson stepped forward and examined Daniel more closely. He lifted the boy's arms to check his muscle development and asked him to open his mouth to look at his teeth. Daniel submitted to this inspection with the resigned expression of someone who had learned not to resist whatever adults chose to do to him. The sight made Sam's stomach turn. "I'll bid $10, Peterson announced. He's small for his age, but he could be useful for light work around the farm. Collecting eggs, feeding chickens, that sort of thing. Give him a few months of regular meals and he might grow into something more substantial." Sam felt anger rising in his chest. Peterson was talking about Daniel as if he were a young colt being evaluated for future potential rather than a hungry child who needed immediate care and compassion. The casual cruelty of treating a 7-year-old as a potential investment was more than Sam could bear. Mrs. Wheeler raised her hand. $12. I could use someone to sweep the store and help with simple tasks. He's small enough to fit into tight spaces to retrieve items from storage. Sam looked at Daniel's face and saw that the boy understood exactly what was happening. There was a deep sadness in his eyes that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. Daniel was not just hungry and scared. He was utterly alone, even while surrounded by people. Sam realized that none of the bidders were seeing Daniel as a child who needed love and security. They were seeing him as a solution to their labor problems. Judge Crawford called for additional bids. "Do I hear $15? The crowd was quiet. Sam could see that most people thought $12 was already too much to pay for such a frail child. Peterson was reconsidering his interest, clearly thinking that Mrs. Wheeler could have Daniel for all he cared. The general consensus seemed to be that Daniel would require too much investment in food and medical care before he could provide any meaningful help. Sam's hands were shaking as he thought about what would happen to Daniel if he went to Mrs. Wheeler. She was not a cruel woman, but she was practical to a fault. She would feed Daniel the minimum necessary to keep him functional and work him as hard as his small body could manage. There would be little warmth or affection in such an arrangement. Maria had often spoken about their quiet house, and how she sometimes imagined what it would sound like with children's voices filling the rooms. She had never pressured Sam about adoption because she knew their financial situation was precarious, but Sam also knew that Maria would welcome a child into their home with all the love she had been storing up for years. The thought of Daniel going to work for Mrs. Wheeler or returning to his desperate parents made Sam's decision for him. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he stepped forward from the crowd and raised his hand. $20, Sam called out in a voice that carried clearly across the square. A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathering. Most people knew Sam Martinez by reputation, and they knew he did not have money to throw away on charity cases. $20 represented a significant portion of his monthly income, and everyone understood that he was making a sacrifice that could put his own family at risk. Judge Crawford looked surprised but relieved. I have $20 from Mr. Martinez. Do I hear 25? The crowd was silent. Peterson and Mrs. Wheeler both looked at Sam with puzzled expressions, as if trying to understand his motivation. Sam kept his eyes focused on Daniel, who was staring back at him with a mixture of hope and fear. $20 going once, Judge Crawford announced. Going twice. He paused and looked around the crowd one final time. Sold to Mr. Samuel Martinez for $20. The transaction was completed quickly after that. Sam approached the courthouse steps to complete the paperwork, while Daniel remained standing exactly where the judge had placed him. The boy seemed uncertain about whether he was allowed to move or speak. Sam knelt down so that he was at eye level with Daniel. Up close, the child's condition was even more heartbreaking. His skin had the pale, almost translucent quality that came from prolonged malnutrition. His clothes were not just worn, they were falling apart. Most disturbing of all was the way Daniel held himself, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. Hello, Daniel, Sam said gently. My name is Sam Martinez. I'd like you to come live with me and my wife Maria on our ranch. Would that be all right with you? Daniel nodded silently, but Sam could see that the boy was overwhelmed. This was probably the most important conversation of his young life, and he clearly had no idea what was expected of him. Are you hungry? Sam asked. For the first time, Daniel's composure cracked slightly. He nodded again, and Sam could see tears forming in his eyes. Well, we'll fix that right away, Sam said with a smile. Maria is probably making lunch right now, and she always cooks too much food. She'll be happy to have someone to help her eat it. Behind them, Daniel's parents approached hesitantly. Sam stood up and turned to face them, unsure what to say in such an impossible situation. The boy's mother looked like she had been crying for hours, and his father appeared to be struggling to maintain his composure. Martinez, Daniel's mother said in a voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for taking him. We didn't know what else. She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Sam felt his own throat tightening with emotion. I'll take good care of him, he promised. You have my word on that. Daniel's father stepped forward and placed a calloused hand on his son's shoulder. You be good for Mr. Martinez, you hear? Do what he tells you and work hard. Yes, Papa, Daniel whispered. The goodbye was brief but devastating. Daniel's mother hugged him fiercely, while his father stood with his hands clenched at his sides. Sam realized that these parents might never see their son again, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. As they walked away from the courthouse, Sam noticed that Daniel kept looking back over his shoulder toward his parents. The boy was trying not to cry, but his small body was trembling with the effort of holding in his emotions. It's all right to be sad, Sam told him gently. This is a big change, and change can be scary even when it's for the best. They walked in silence toward the edge of town where Sam had tied his horse and wagon. Several townspeople watched them pass, and Sam could hear whispered conversations starting behind them. He knew that by evening, everyone in Millfield would know that careful Sam Martinez had spent $20 on a starving orphan boy. When they reached the wagon, Sam helped Daniel climb onto the wooden seat beside him. The boy seemed amazed by the simple kindness of being helped up rather than expected to manage on his own. Sam realized that Daniel had probably been taking care of himself for quite some time. As they drove out of town toward the Martinez ranch, Sam found himself wondering what Maria would say when he arrived home with Daniel. They had discussed the possibility of taking in a child at some point, but always in abstract terms. Sam had made this decision impulsively, driven by compassion rather than careful planning. The ranch house came into view as they rounded a bend in the dirt road. It was a modest wooden structure with a wide front porch and a red tin roof. The paint was somewhat faded, and the fence needed repair in several places, but it was clearly a home where people lived and loved rather than just survived. Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the wagon approaching. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked around to the front yard, expecting to see Sam returning from his trip to town with perhaps some supplies or news from neighbors. Instead, she saw her husband sitting beside a small, thin boy who looked like he had not had a proper meal in months. Maria's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She could see that the child was exhausted, frightened, and desperately in need of care. Sam helped Daniel down from the wagon and then took his wife's hands in his own. "Maria," he said softly, "this is Daniel Morrison. His family was struggling, and I thought perhaps we could help him." Maria looked into Daniel's large, solemn eyes and felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. She had dreamed of this moment for so many years, the moment when a child would come into their lives and make their family complete. She had imagined it differently, of course, but the reality was even more meaningful than her dreams. "Hello, Daniel," Maria said, kneeling down to his level just as Sam had done. "Welcome to our home." For the first time since Sam had met him, Daniel smiled. It was a small, tentative expression, but it transformed his entire face. In that moment, Sam knew that he had made the right decision, regardless of what challenges lay ahead. The first thing Maria did was draw a warm bath for Daniel. The boy had never experienced anything quite like it. Hot water, real soap, and towels that smelled like sunshine from hanging on the line. He was hesitant at first, unsure if he was truly allowed such luxury, but Maria's gentle encouragement helped him understand that this was normal in his new home. While Daniel bathed, Maria and Sam spoke quietly in the kitchen. Maria examined the clothes Daniel had been wearing and shook her head sadly. They were beyond saving, worn thin with holes and stains that would never come out. She would need to make him new clothes. But in the meantime, she found some of Sam's old shirts that she could temporarily alter. "How much did you pay?" Maria asked, though she could see from Sam's expression that money was not really the issue. $20, Sam replied. "But Maria, you should have seen how they were looking at him. Like he was a work animal they were considering purchasing. That boy needs love, not just food and shelter." Maria nodded, understanding completely. She had seen the hollow look in Daniel's eyes when they arrived, the way he seemed to expect disappointment or harsh treatment at any moment. It would take time to convince him that he was safe. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom wearing one of Sam's shirts that reached nearly to his ankles, Maria had to bite back tears. Clean and with his hair properly combed, the boy's true features were visible for the first time. He had intelligent dark eyes, delicate features, and despite his thinness, there was something inherently strong about his small frame. The first meal Daniel ate at the Martinez table was a revelation for everyone involved. Maria had prepared beef stew with fresh bread, vegetables from their garden, and milk from their cow. Daniel stared at the food for a long moment, as if he could not quite believe it was meant for him. "Go ahead," Sam encouraged. "Eat as much as you want." Daniel took a small bite, then another, and then began eating with the focused intensity of someone who had learned never to waste food. Maria and Sam exchanged glances, realizing that Daniel had probably not had a proper meal in weeks, possibly months. They had to gently remind him to slow down, explaining that there was plenty more food and that he did not need to eat as if it might be taken away. This concept seemed foreign to Daniel, but he gradually began to trust that the food would still be there if he paused between bites. After dinner, Maria showed Daniel to the small room that would be his. It had been used for storage, but Sam had quickly moved boxes and arranged a simple bed with clean sheets. To Daniel, it might as well have been a palace. He had been sleeping on the ground or in makeshift shelters for so long that having a real bed with pillows and blankets seemed almost miraculous. "This is my room?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Yes," Maria said softly. "This is your home now, Daniel. Your room, your bed, your family." That night, Sam and Maria could hear Daniel crying quietly in his room. They wanted to comfort him, but they understood that he needed time to process everything that had happened. The boy had lost his parents and his old life, even if that life had been difficult. Now he was in a completely new environment with people he barely knew. The kindness was probably as overwhelming as the fear. The next morning brought their first real challenge. Daniel woke before dawn, dressed himself in the oversized clothes Maria had given him, and was waiting in the kitchen when Sam came in for his morning coffee. The boy was sitting perfectly still at the table, his hands folded in his lap, looking like he was waiting for instructions. "Good morning, Daniel," Sam said. "Did you sleep well?" Daniel nodded politely but did not speak. Sam could see that the boy was nervous, probably wondering what would be expected of him in exchange for the food and shelter he had received. "Are you hungry?" Sam asked. Again, Daniel nodded but remained silent. Sam began to understand that Daniel was waiting to be told what to do, when to eat, where to go, and how to behave. The boy had learned to be passive and obedient as a survival strategy, but it broke Sam's heart to see such resignation in someone so young. Maria joined them for breakfast, and together they began the delicate process of helping Daniel understand his new situation. They explained that he was not a servant or hired help. He was part of their family now. He would have chores appropriate for his age, just like any child, but he would also have time for play and learning. This concept seemed to confuse Daniel. In his experience, children worked as hard as adults when there was work to be done, and play was a luxury that starving families could not afford. The idea that he might have time for activities that served no immediate practical purpose was foreign to him. Sam decided to start by showing Daniel around the ranch. They walked the property together, with Sam explaining how everything worked. They had 12 head of cattle, several horses, chickens for eggs, a vegetable garden, and a small orchard with apple and peach trees. Daniel listened intently to everything Sam said, asking occasional questions that showed he was intelligent and observant. He had clearly spent time around farms before and understood the basics of animal care and agriculture. What impressed Sam most was the boy's obvious eagerness to learn and help, despite his physical weakness. When they reached the chicken coop, Daniel showed the first spark of genuine interest Sam had seen from him. The boy watched the chickens pecking and scratching with obvious fascination. And when Sam handed him a basket to collect eggs, Daniel approached the task with careful concentration. "I used to help my mama with chickens," Daniel said quietly. It was the first time he had mentioned his previous life without being directly asked. "Did you?" Sam responded encouragingly. "I bet you were good at it." Daniel nodded, a small smile appearing on his face, as he successfully retrieved an egg from under a particularly protective hen. "Mama said I was better with the chickens than Papa because I was gentler." Over the following days, Sam and Maria began to see glimpses of the real Daniel beneath the fearful, overly compliant exterior he had developed. The boy was naturally curious, surprisingly funny when he felt comfortable enough to speak freely, and possessed of a deep empathy for animals and people alike. However, Daniel's adjustment was not without challenges. He hoarded food in his room, apparently unable to believe that regular meals would continue indefinitely. Maria discovered bread crusts and pieces of fruit hidden under his mattress and realized that Daniel was preparing for the possibility that the abundance might suddenly end. Rather than scold him, Maria sat down with Daniel and explained gently that there would always be enough food in their house. She showed him the pantry, the root cellar where they stored preserved foods, and the garden where fresh vegetables grew. It took several weeks before Daniel stopped hiding food, and even then, he would sometimes ask permission before taking an apple or a piece of bread. The boy also had difficulty sleeping through the night. Sam and Maria often heard him having nightmares, though he never spoke about what frightened him in his dreams. Sometimes they would find him sitting by the window in the early hours of the morning, staring out at the road as if watching for something or someone. Maria suspected that Daniel was worried his birth parents might come back for him, or that some authority figure might decide he needed to be moved again. The boy had experienced so much instability that the concept of permanence was hard for him to grasp. School presented another challenge entirely. Daniel had been out of formal education for months, and before that, his schooling had been sporadic due to his family's frequent moves in search of work. He could read simple words and write his name, but he was significantly behind other children his age. When Sam and Maria took Daniel to meet the schoolteacher, Mrs. Patterson, they were prepared for resistance. Many people in town still viewed Daniel as charity case, rather than a real member of the Martinez family. Mrs. Dick Patterson, however, surprised them with her immediate acceptance and determination to help Daniel catch up academically.
"He's obviously intelligent. Mrs. Perry's coming,"
Patterson told Sam and Maria after spending an hour evaluating Daniel's skills. "He just needs time and attention. I've seen children overcome much larger educational gaps when they're in stable homes with people who care about their success." Daniel's first days at school were difficult in ways Sam and Maria had not anticipated. The other children were curious about the boy who had been bought at auction, and their questions were often tactless and sometimes cruel. Some children had been told by their parents that Daniel was lucky to have been rescued, while others had heard their families discussing the impropriety of the auction system. Daniel came home from school each day exhausted and overwhelmed. He was trying to absorb new academic information while also navigating complex social dynamics that he had never encountered before. In his previous life, survival had been the primary concern. Now he was expected to learn arithmetic, spelling, and social skills simultaneously. Maria worked with Daniel every evening on his homework, and Sam helped him practice reading aloud. They discovered that Daniel had an excellent memory and could master material quickly once he understood the basic concepts. His main challenge was confidence. He was so afraid of making mistakes that he would sometimes refuse to attempt problems he was capable of solving. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning in late October. Daniel had been with them for 2 weeks, and while he was clearly more comfortable than when he first arrived, he still maintained the careful, watchful demeanor of someone expecting disappointment. Sam was repairing a section of fence when he noticed Daniel watching him work. The boy had been told he could play or explore the ranch while Sam completed his chores, but Daniel seemed drawn to the work itself. "Would you like to help?" Sam asked. Daniel nodded eagerly, and Sam showed him how to hold the fence posts steady while Sam hammered in the nails. It was simple work, but it required coordination between the two of them. As they worked together, Sam noticed that Daniel began to relax in a way he had not seen before. They worked in companionable silence for a while, with Daniel proving to be a surprisingly capable assistant. The boy anticipated what Sam needed and handed him tools without being asked. More importantly, Daniel seemed to take genuine pride in contributing to the work. "My papa taught me to use a hammer," Daniel said as they moved to the next section of fence. "He said I was getting good at it." "I can tell," Sam replied. "You've got steady hands and good judgment about where the nails should go." As they continued working, Daniel began talking more freely than he had since arriving at the ranch. He told Sam about helping his father with various jobs, about things he remembered from better times when his family had been more secure, and about his hopes for learning new skills. "Do you think," Daniel asked hesitantly, "that someday I could learn to take care of the cattle like you do?" Sam looked at the serious expression on Daniel's face and realized that the boy was not just asking about cattle care, he was asking if Sam planned to keep him long enough to teach him important skills. Daniel was testing whether this arrangement was temporary charity or something more permanent. "I think," Sam said carefully, "that you're going to learn to do lots of things around this ranch. Cattle care, horse training, crop planting, equipment repair, all of it. A ranch needs someone who understands how all the pieces fit together." Daniel's face lit up with the first genuinely happy expression Sam had seen from him. "Really? You'd teach me all that?" "Daniel," Sam said, setting down his hammer and looking directly at the boy. "You're my son now. Of course I'm going to teach you everything I know." The word son hung in the air between them. Daniel stared at Sam with wide eyes as if he could not quite believe what he had heard. Sam realized that he had made a commitment that went beyond providing food and shelter. He was claiming Daniel as family in the truest sense. That evening at dinner, the atmosphere was different than it had been since Daniel's arrival. The boy participated in conversation more actively, asked questions about ranch operations, and even laughed at one of Sam's jokes. Maria noticed the change immediately and caught Sam's eye across the table with a smile that conveyed her approval and happiness. After Daniel went to bed that night, Sam and Maria sat on their front porch in the comfortable silence they had always shared. The October air was crisp, but not yet cold, and the stars were brilliant in the clear sky. "He called me Papa today," Maria said softly, "when he was helping me with the laundry." "Just once, and then he got embarrassed about it, but he said it." Sam felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee he was drinking. He's starting to trust that this is real, that we're not going anywhere. "Some of the people in town are saying we're crazy," Maria continued. "Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that we can't afford to feed another mouth and that Daniel will probably run away as soon as he's old enough to fend for himself." Sam considered this. He knew that their decision had been controversial, and he understood the practical concerns people had raised. $20 was a significant expense for them, and they would need to stretch their budget to accommodate Daniel's needs for clothing, school supplies, and eventually medical care. "Maybe they're right about the money," Sam admitted. "We'll have to be more careful about expenses, and we might have to go without some things we want." "But Maria, when I think about what might have happened to that boy," he did not need to finish the sentence. They both knew that Daniel's alternatives had been grim. Mrs. Wheeler would have worked him hard for minimal care. Peterson might have treated him reasonably but would have seen him primarily as farmhand rather than a child. Other potential outcomes have been even worse. Besides, Maria added, having Daniel here changes things in good ways too. The house feels more alive with him in it, and you should see how much more I enjoy cooking now that I'm feeding someone who appreciates every bite. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts about the dramatic change their lives had taken in just 2 weeks. Neither of them could have predicted that morning in October that they would end the month as parents, but both of them felt that Daniel had filled a space in their lives they had not fully realized was empty. Inside the house, Daniel lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, he was not crying or worrying about tomorrow. Instead, he was thinking about the word Sam had used. Son. It was a concept that seemed too good to be true, but the evidence of its truth was all around him. He had clean clothes, regular meals, adults who listened when he spoke, and meaningful work to do. More than that, he had begun to feel something he had not experienced in many months: hope for the future. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine growing up on this ranch, learning everything Sam could teach him, and maybe someday having a family of his own to care for. As he drifted off to sleep, Daniel made a promise to himself. He would work as hard as he could to prove that Sam and Maria had made the right decision. He would study diligently, help with every task he was given, and try to become the kind of son that would make them proud. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees around the ranch house, carrying with it the sense of the changing season and the promise of new beginnings. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that tested the newfound stability of Daniel's life with the Martinez family. The first snowfall came in mid-November, covering the ranch in a pristine white blanket that Daniel had never seen before. His previous winters had been spent in warmer climates, and the sight of snow-covered fields filled him with wonder and excitement. Sam found Daniel that morning standing on the front porch in his nightclothes, staring at the transformed landscape with amazement. The boy's breath came out in small puffs of vapor as he reached out tentatively to catch snowflakes on his palm. "First time seeing snow?" Sam asked, wrapping a blanket around Daniel's shoulders. Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving the falling flakes. "It's like stars coming down from the sky," he said softly. Sam smiled at the poetic observation. Over the past month, he had discovered that Daniel possessed an unexpectedly lyrical way of looking at the world. The boy noticed details that adults often missed and expressed them in ways that revealed both intelligence and sensitivity. The arrival of winter meant that ranch work would change significantly. The cattle needed more attention as grazing became difficult, and firewood had to be cut and stored for the cold months ahead. Sam had been concerned about how Daniel would handle the increased workload and harsh weather, but the boy surprised him with his resilience and determination. Daniel threw himself into winter preparations with enthusiasm. He learned to split kindling, helped Sam repair the barn roof before the heavy snows arrived, and took particular pride in ensuring that the animals were comfortable and well-fed. Maria marveled at how quickly he had adapted to ranch life and how naturally he seemed to understand what needed to be done. School continued to present challenges, but Daniel was making steady progress. Mrs. Patterson had implemented a special study plan that allowed him to work at his own pace while still participating in regular classroom activities. Daniel's reading skills improved dramatically, and his natural mathematical ability began to emerge as his confidence grew. However, it was his relationships with other children that remained complicated. Some of his classmates had accepted him readily, curious about his unique background and impressed by his knowledge of animals and farm work. Others remained suspicious or actively hostile, repeating things they had heard their parents say about charity cases and auction children. The situation came to a head on a cold December afternoon when Daniel arrived home from school with a black eye and torn clothes. Maria was hanging laundry in the kitchen when she saw him trying to sneak into the house without being noticed. "Daniel Martinez," she called out, using the surname they had begun using naturally. "Come here right this instant." Daniel approached reluctantly, knowing he could not hide his appearance. Maria's expression shifted from stern to concerned as she saw the extent of his injuries. "What happened?" she asked gently, guiding him to a chair and beginning to clean the cut on his lip. Daniel was reluctant to explain, but Maria's patient questioning eventually revealed the story. 3 older boys had cornered him after school, calling him names and demanding to know how much money his fake family had paid for him. When Daniel tried to walk away, they had pushed him down and begun hitting him. "Did you fight back?" Maria asked. Daniel shook his head. "Papa always said fighting makes everything worse. I just tried to cover my head until they got tired of hitting me." Maria felt a surge of anger toward the children who had hurt Daniel, but also profound sadness for what this incident revealed about his past. Daniel had learned to endure abuse passively, probably as a survival strategy during the difficult times before coming to live with them. When Sam returned from town that evening, Maria told him what had happened. Sam's jaw tightened with anger, but like Maria, he recognized that this was about more than one playground altercation. Sam sat down with Daniel and spoke to him seriously about the situation. "Son, I understand why you didn't fight back. Your father was trying to teach you that violence doesn't solve problems, and he was right about that most of the time. But," Daniel prompted, sensing that Sam had more to say. "But sometimes," Sam continued carefully, "a person has to stand up for themselves when someone else is trying to hurt them. You have every right to defend yourself, and you have my permission to do it if necessary." Daniel looked uncertain. "What if I get in trouble at school?" "Then we'll deal with it together," Sam assured him. "Mrs. Patterson is a fair woman, and she'll understand the difference between starting a fight and finishing one that someone else started." The conversation continued, with Sam teaching Daniel some basic defensive techniques, not to encourage violence, but to give him tools for protecting himself if necessary. More importantly, they talked about Daniel's worth as a person and his right to be treated with respect. "You are not a charity case," Sam said firmly. "You are our son. You belong in this family and in this community just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel differently." Daniel nodded, but Sam could see that fully believing this would take time. Years of instability and being treated as a burden had left deep marks on the boy's self-perception. The next week brought an opportunity for Daniel to apply what Sam had taught him. The same group of boys approached him after school, apparently emboldened by his previous passive response. This time, however, when they began pushing him around, Daniel stood his ground. "Leave me alone," he said firmly, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised everyone, including himself. The largest of the boys laughed and shoved Daniel harder. "Or what? You'll pretend Daddy will come save you?" Daniel felt anger flash through him, not just at the physical attack, but at the insult to Sam. Without thinking, he swung back, catching the boy off guard with a solid punch to the stomach. The fight that followed was brief but decisive, with Daniel using his small size and quickness to his advantage. When the dust settled, Daniel was the only one still standing. The other boys, nursing bruised egos along with their physical injuries, retreated while making threats about getting him in trouble. Daniel walked home that afternoon with his head held high for the first time since starting school. Sam noticed the change in Daniel's demeanor immediately. The boy was not boastful about the fight, but there was a new self-assurance in his manner that had not been there before. When Daniel explained what had happened, Sam felt a complex mixture of pride and concern. "Are you hurt?" Sam asked first. Daniel shook his head. "Just my knuckles are a little sore." "Good. And how do you feel about what happened?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I feel like I stood up for our family," he said finally. "They said you weren't my real father, and that made me angry." Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion. The fact that Daniel saw defending the family's honor as his responsibility spoke volumes about how completely he had accepted his place in their lives. As expected, there were consequences. Mrs. Wade Patterson called Sam to school the next day to discuss the fight. However, she had also spoken with several witnesses and understood the circumstances that had led to the altercation. "I don't approve of fighting," Mrs. Patterson told Sam, "but I also don't approve of bullying." Daniel has been remarkably patient with provocation that would have tested any child's limits. The boys who had started the fight were suspended for 3 days while Daniel received only a warning. More importantly, word of Daniel's ability to defend himself spread through the school, and the bullying stopped entirely. This incident marked a turning point in Daniel's integration into the community. Children who had been neutral before began including him in games and activities. Adults who had viewed him with skepticism started seeing him as a real member of the Martinez family rather than a temporary charity project. Christmas approached with an excitement that Daniel had never experienced before. Maria threw herself into preparations with the joy of someone who finally had a child to celebrate with. She made new clothes for Daniel, baked special treats, and planned a celebration that would create memories to last a lifetime. Daniel was overwhelmed by the generosity of his first Christmas with the Martinez family. Sam had carved him a wooden horse, painted and detailed with incredible care. Maria had sewn him a warm winter coat and knitted mittens and a scarf. Most precious of all was a small leather journal with his initials burned into the cover. "For writing down your thoughts and observations," Maria explained. Sam and I have noticed that you see the world in special ways, and those thoughts are worth preserving. Daniel held the journal like it was made of gold. The idea that his thoughts were valuable enough to record was revolutionary to a boy who had spent most of his life being told to stay quiet and out of the way. That Christmas night, Daniel made his first entry in the journal. This was the best day of my life. Mama Maria made roast chicken and apple pie, and Papa Sam taught me to play checkers. I won 2 games and he said I was a natural strategist. I never knew that belonging to a family could feel like this. I hope I can be the kind of son they deserve. Winter deepened, bringing challenges that tested the entire family's resilience. A late January blizzard knocked out power lines and made travel impossible for nearly a week. The Martinez family was snowed in with limited supplies and no way to get to town for additional provisions. Daniel's reaction to this crisis revealed how much he had grown in confidence and capability. Instead of panicking or withdrawing, he approached the situation as a problem to be solved. He helped Sam manage the animals in difficult conditions, assisted Maria in rationing food supplies, and maintained a positive attitude that helped keep everyone's spirits up. "We've weathered tough times before," Daniel said one evening as they sat around the fireplace playing cards by candlelight, "and we're together, so we can get through anything." Sam and Maria exchanged glances over Daniel's head, recognizing that their son had internalized the security and strength that comes from belonging to a loving family. The boy who had been purchased at auction 6 months earlier had transformed into a confident young man with deep roots and unshakable faith in his family bonds. When the storm finally passed and they were able to get to town, Sam was surprised by the reception they received. Multiple neighbors approached him to ask about Daniel's well-being during the storm, and several people commented on what a fine boy he was becoming. "That son of yours helped my husband dig out our cattle when the barn roof collapsed," Mrs. Henderson told Sam at the general store. "He worked like a man twice his size and never complained once about the cold." Sam realized that Daniel had been quietly winning over the community through his actions rather than his words. The boy who had once been viewed with suspicion was now seen as a valuable member of the community in his own right. Spring arrived with a burst of activity on the ranch. Daniel threw himself into planting season with enthusiasm, having spent the winter studying farming techniques in books that Mrs. Forth Patterson had lent him. His suggestions for crop rotation and pest control impressed Sam with their thoughtfulness and practical application. "Where did you learn about companion planting?" Sam asked after Daniel suggested planting beans near the corn. "I read about it in one of Mrs. Patterson's agricultural books," Daniel replied. "The beans fix nitrogen in the soil that the corn needs, and the corn provides support for the bean vines to climb. It's like they help each other grow better." Sam smiled at this explanation, recognizing that Daniel was describing more than agricultural techniques. The boy understood cooperation and mutual support in ways that went far beyond farming, probably because he had experienced it firsthand in his new family. By Daniel's first anniversary with the Martinez family, the transformation was complete but not dramatic. There had been no single moment when everything changed. Instead, there had been hundreds of small moments that gradually built trust, confidence, and belonging. Daniel had grown several inches and gained weight, but more importantly, he had gained the self-assurance that comes from being unconditionally loved and valued. His academic performance had improved to the point where he was among the top students in his class. His relationships with other children were positive and normal. Most significantly, Daniel had begun planning for his future with the assumption that he would inherit and continue the ranch's operations. He spoke casually about improvements he wanted to make, animals he wanted to raise, and crops he wanted to try. The boy who had once lived day to day now thought in terms of years and decades. On the October evening that marked exactly 1 year since the auction, Sam and Maria sat on their porch watching Daniel play with Rex in the front yard. The scene was so normal and peaceful that it was hard to remember how dramatically different their lives had been just 12 months earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked softly. "The money, the worry, the complications?" Sam watched Daniel teaching Rex a new trick, laughing as the old dog struggled to follow commands that were probably too complex for his aging mind. The boy's laughter was pure joy, free from the fear and uncertainty that had characterized his early days with them. "Never," Sam said firmly. "Best $20 I ever spent." Maria nodded in agreement, but they both knew that the money had been the smallest part of their investment. They had given Daniel security, love, education, and opportunity. In return, he had given them purpose, joy, and the satisfaction of knowing they had changed a life in the most fundamental way possible. Daniel called out from the yard, asking if he could take Rex down to the creek before dark. Sam waved his permission, and they watched as boy and dog headed off together, Daniel chattering about his plans for tomorrow, while Rex listened with the patient attention that old dogs reserve for beloved children. In that moment, Sam and Maria knew with absolute certainty that their decision had been right. Daniel was not just surviving, he was thriving. And in helping him grow, they had discovered parts of themselves they never knew existed. 3 years had passed since Daniel joined the Martinez family, and life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Daniel, now 10 years old, had grown into a capable young man who could handle ranch responsibilities that would challenge many adults. His academic achievements had earned him recognition throughout the county, and his reputation for reliability and kindness had made him a favorite among neighbors and townspeople. It was a warm August morning in 1937 when everything changed. Sam was in the barn repairing equipment while Daniel helped Maria tend to the vegetable garden. Rex, now showing his age but still devoted to Daniel, lay panting in the shade of the apple tree nearby. The peaceful domestic scene was interrupted by the sound of an automobile approaching the house. Cars were still relatively uncommon in their rural area, so the arrival of any vehicle was noteworthy. Sam emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, as a dusty black Ford pulled into their yard. 2 men in suits stepped out, looking formal and out of place in the ranch setting. The older of the 2 men, a thin individual with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, approached Sam with an official-looking document in his hand. His younger companion, a heavy-set man with nervous mannerisms, stayed near the car as if uncertain about the reception they might receive. "Are you Samuel Martinez?" the older man asked, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "I am," Sam replied, feeling an immediate sense of unease. In his experience, men in suits bringing official documents rarely brought good news. "My name is Harold Morrison. I'm from the State Department of Child Welfare. This is my associate, Mr. Jenkins. We're here about Daniel Morrison." Sam felt the world shift beneath his feet. He had known this moment might come someday, but as the years had passed without incident, he had begun to hope that Daniel's legal status would never be questioned. Now, looking at the serious expressions of the 2 officials, he realized that hope had been naive. "What about Daniel?" Sam asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Morrison consulted his documents before answering. "There have been some concerns raised about the circumstances of Daniel's placement with your family. We need to conduct an investigation to ensure that proper procedures were followed and that the child's welfare is being adequately protected." From the garden, Daniel had heard unfamiliar voices and approached curiously. Maria tried to keep him occupied with their gardening tasks, but it was obvious that the boy was listening to the conversation with growing concern. "What kind of concerns?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The auction system used in your county 3 years ago was not officially sanctioned by the state," Mr. Morrison explained. "While we understand that local authorities were trying to address a humanitarian crisis, there are questions about the legality of transferring custody of children through such methods." Sam felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Daniel has been with us for 3 years. He's thriving here. He's doing well in school, he's healthy, and he's part of our family."
I'm sure that's true. Mr.
Morrison said, though his tone suggested he was reserving judgment. "However, we have procedures that must be followed to ensure children's safety and legal protection. We need to verify that Daniel's best interests are being served and that all legal requirements have been met." Daniel could no longer pretend to focus on the garden. He approached the group of adults with obvious anxiety, positioning himself close to Sam in a gesture that spoke volumes about where he felt safe and protected. "Papa Sam," Daniel said quietly, "is everything all right?" The word Papa clearly registered with both officials. Mr. Jenkins made a note on his clipboard while Mr. Baer lead. Morrison studied Daniel's appearance and demeanor with professional assessment. "Everything's fine, son," Sam said, placing a protective hand on Daniel's shoulder. "These gentlemen just have some questions about paperwork." Mr. Morrison addressed Daniel directly. "Daniel, I'm Mr. Morrison from the state government. I'd like to ask you a few questions about how you're doing here. Would that be all right?" Daniel looked uncertain, glancing between Mr. Gabber, Morrison and Sam as if seeking permission or guidance. His instinctive wariness around strangers had never completely disappeared, even after years of security with the Martinez family. "You can answer his questions," Sam encouraged, though every parental instinct he possessed was screaming at him to shield Daniel from this intrusion. "Are you happy living here, Mr. Raff?" Morrison asked. Daniel nodded emphatically. "Yes, sir. Very happy." "Do you go to school regularly?" "Yes, sir. I'm one of the top students in my class," Daniel replied with quiet pride. "And Mr. Greary?" And Mrs. Martinez treat you well? Daniel's expression shifted to confusion, as if the question itself was incomprehensible. They're my parents, he said simply. They love me, and I love them, Mr. Fedula. Morrison continued his questioning for several more minutes, covering Daniel's daily routine, his relationships with other children, his healthcare, and his understanding of his situation. Throughout the interview, Daniel's answers consistently reflected a child who was well cared for, emotionally secure, and genuinely happy with his life. However, when Mr. Morrison asked about Daniel's memories of his birth family, the boy's demeanor changed noticeably. His answers became shorter and less detailed, and Sam could see that discussing his life before the Martinez family was still painful for Daniel. Do you remember your birth parents? Mr. Morrison asked. Some, Daniel admitted quietly. Do you miss them? Daniel was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with the question. I think about them sometimes, he finally said. I hope they're okay, but this is my family now. After the interview concluded, Mr. Morrison requested a private conversation with Sam and Maria. Daniel was reluctant to leave, sensing that his future was being discussed, but Sam assured him that everything would be all right and sent him to complete his chores. Mr. Martinez, Mr. Morrison began once they were alone. I want you to understand that this investigation is not necessarily adversarial. From what I've observed today, it appears that Daniel is doing well in your care. Then what's the problem? Maria asked, speaking for the first time since the official's arrival. The problem, Mr. Morrison explained, is that the custody arrangement was never formalized through proper legal channels. In the eyes of the state, you have no legal authority over Daniel. You can't make medical decisions for him, you can't authorize educational placement changes, and you have no protection if someone challenges your right to care for him. Sam felt a chill run down his spine. Is someone challenging our right to care for him? Mr. Morrison exchanged a glance with his companion before answering. Daniel's birth father contacted our office 6 months ago. He's remarried now, his financial situation has stabilized, and he wants his son back. The words hit Sam like a physical blow. After 3 years of building a life together, after Daniel had flourished and grown into the confident, capable boy he was today, his birth father wanted to reclaim him based on improved circumstances. Where has he been for 3 years? Maria asked, her voice tight with emotion. When his son needed him most, where was he?
I understand your feelings, Mr. Peter,
Morrison said diplomatically. But legally, biological parents have primary rights, unless those rights have been legally terminated. Mr. Van Keeper, Morrison, Daniel's father, was never found unfit. He was simply unable to provide for his child during a period of economic hardship. Sam struggled to process this information rationally. He understood the legal principles involved, but the thought of Daniel being removed from their home seemed like a form of emotional violence that served no one's best interests. What happens now? Sam asked. We'll complete our investigation over the next few weeks, Mr. Morrison explained. We'll interview Daniel's teachers, neighbors, and anyone else who can speak to his welfare in your care. We'll also evaluate Mr. Ofele, Morrison's current living situation, and his ability to provide for Daniel. And then, Maria pressed, then a judge will make a determination about what's in Daniel's best interests, Mr. Morrison said. The child's welfare is always our primary concern, but we also have to respect parental rights when those rights haven't been legally terminated. After the officials left, Sam and Maria found themselves facing the most difficult conversation of their marriage.
Daniel was in the barn, ostensibly checking on the horses, but probably trying to process what he had overheard of the afternoon's discussions.
We have to tell him, Maria said, tears streaming down her face. He has a right to know what's happening. How do we tell a 10-year-old that the father who abandoned him 3 years ago now wants him back? Sam asked. How do we explain that the state might force him to leave the only stable home he's ever known? They sat in their kitchen, the same room where they had served Daniel his first meal 3 years earlier, and tried to find words for an impossible situation. Outside, they could hear Daniel talking softly to the horses, probably seeking comfort in the familiar routine of animal care. When Daniel came in for dinner, it was obvious that he knew something significant had happened. He sat at the table quietly, eating without his usual appetite, and glancing frequently at Sam and Maria, as if trying to read their expressions. Finally, Sam decided that honesty was the only option. Daniel, we need to talk about what happened today with those men from the state. Daniel put down his fork and looked at Sam with serious eyes. Are they going to take me away? The directness of the question caught Sam off guard, but he realized that Daniel's survival instincts were still sharp enough to recognize a threat to his security. We don't know, Sam said honestly. They're investigating our family to make sure you're being properly cared for. But Daniel, there's something else you need to know. Sam explained about Daniel's birth father's contact with the state, his improved circumstances, and his desire to reclaim custody. He watched Daniel's face carefully as he spoke, seeing a complex mixture of emotions play across the boy's features. My real father wants me back? Daniel asked quietly. Your birth father, Sam corrected gently. We're your real family now, but the man who helped bring you into the world is asking the state to let you live with him again. Daniel was silent for several minutes, processing this information with the seriousness of someone much older than 10 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sad. I don't want to leave, he said simply. This is my home. You and Mama Maria are my parents. I don't even remember him very well anymore. Maria reached across the table to take Daniel's hand. We don't want you to leave either, sweetheart. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
What if it's not enough? Daniel asked, voicing the fear that all three of them shared.
Sam looked at his son, and Daniel was his son in every way that mattered, and made a promise he hoped he could keep. Then we'll figure out another way. Families don't give up on each other, and we're not giving up on you. Over the following weeks, the state investigation proceeded with bureaucratic thoroughness. Officials interviewed Mrs. Patterson, who provided glowing reports about Daniel's academic progress and social adjustment. They spoke with neighbors who universally praised the Martinez family's care for Daniel and his positive impact on the community. Dr. Harrison examined Daniel and confirmed that he was healthy, well-nourished, and showed no signs of abuse or neglect. The boy's medical records revealed steady growth, proper dental care, and all necessary vaccinations, evidence of consistent, responsible parenting. However, the investigation also included meetings with Daniel's birth father, Thomas Morrison. Sam learned that Morrison had indeed remarried, found steady work in a factory 2 counties away, and established what appeared to be a stable household. From a legal standpoint, he seemed to have addressed the issues that had led to his inability to care for Daniel 3 years earlier. The waiting was the hardest part. Daniel tried to maintain his normal routine, but Sam and Maria could see the stress affecting him. He had difficulty sleeping, his appetite decreased, and he became uncharacteristically withdrawn. The boy who had blossomed with security was wilting under the uncertainty of his future. 3 weeks after the initial visit, Mr. Gier, icon bad, Morrison returned with news that would change all their lives once again. He sat in the same kitchen where Daniel had eaten his first meal with the Martinez family and delivered his findings. The state has concluded its investigation, he began, consulting his extensive notes. In every measurable way, Daniel is thriving in your care. His academic achievement, social development, physical health, and emotional well-being are all exemplary. Sam felt a moment of hope, but Mr. Morrison's expression suggested that this positive assessment was not the end of the story. However, Morrison continued, we also found that Thomas Morrison has genuinely addressed the issues that led to his inability to care for his son. He has steady employment, a stable marriage, and has expressed sincere remorse about the circumstances that led to Daniel's placement at auction. So, what does that mean? Maria asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. It means the case will go before a family court judge next month, Mr. Morrison explained. The judge will consider all factors and make a determination about custody that serves Daniel's best interests. Sam realized that they were facing a legal battle for their son's future, and the outcome was far from certain. Despite Daniel's obvious happiness and success in their care, the legal system still gave preference to biological parents, unless there were compelling reasons to do otherwise. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Sam and Maria made a decision that would require every resource they possessed and some they didn't have. They would hire a lawyer and fight for legal custody of their son. Whatever the cost, whatever the odds, they would not give up Daniel without exhausting every possible option. The boy who would cost them $20 at auction was about to cost them much more, but Sam and Maria knew with absolute certainty that he was worth any price they might have to pay. The month leading up to the court hearing passed like a slow-motion nightmare for the Martinez family. Sam had hired the only lawyer in the county who specialized in family law, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Sullivan, who made it clear from the beginning that their case would be challenging. The law strongly favors biological parents, Mrs. Sullivan explained during their first meeting. Unless we can prove that returning Daniel to his birth father would be harmful to the child, the court will likely rule in favor of biological custody. Sam felt the weight of 3 years of love and investment hanging in the balance. Harmful? The boy doesn't even remember his birth father clearly. We're his family now. I understand your feelings, Mrs. Bean, dear, Sullivan said sympathetically, but legally, that's not sufficient grounds to deny parental rights. We need to focus on Daniel's best interests from an objective standpoint. Meanwhile, Daniel was struggling with emotions that no 10-year-old should have to navigate. He had been interviewed by court-appointed social workers, psychologists, and child advocates, all asking him detailed questions about his feelings, memories, and preferences. The boy who had once been confident and secure was becoming anxious and withdrawn under the pressure. I told them I want to stay here, Daniel confided to Sam one evening as they worked together in the barn. I told them you and Mama Maria are my real parents, but they keep asking me about remembering my birth father and whether I might be happy with him. Sam's heart broke seeing his son's distress. What do you tell them? I tell them I don't remember much about before, Daniel said quietly. I remember being hungry and scared a lot. I remember my birth mother crying. I remember the auction where you bought me, but I don't really remember him. The truth was that Daniel's memories of his early childhood were fragmentary and traumatic. The stable, loving environment he had known for 3 years had allowed him to heal from those experiences, but the current situation was forcing him to revisit painful memories he had mostly suppressed. 2 weeks before the hearing, Mrs. Sullivan received discovery materials from Thomas Morrison's attorney that changed everything about their case. She called Sam to her office immediately after reviewing the documents, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of excitement. Sam, I need you to sit down, she said, spreading papers across her desk. I've found something that changes everything. Sam studied the documents Mrs. Sullivan handed him, trying to understand their significance. They appeared to be employment records, court documents, and police reports dating from the time period when Daniel had been living with his birth family. What am I looking at? Sam asked. Thomas Morrison's history, Mrs. Sullivan explained. His attorney provided these documents to demonstrate his current stability, but they've inadvertently revealed information that undermines his custody claim. She pointed to a series of police reports from 1933 and early 1934. Morrison was arrested 3 times for public intoxication and once for disturbing the peace. There are also reports of domestic disturbances at his address, though no charges were filed. Sam felt a cold anger building as he read the details. He was drinking while Daniel was going hungry? It gets worse. Mrs. Dublin, Sullivan continued, showing him employment records. Morrison was fired from 2 jobs in 1933 for showing up drunk. The family wasn't just struggling because of the depression, they were struggling because he had a serious drinking problem. The final piece of evidence was the most damaging. Hospital records showed that Daniel had been treated for malnutrition and a broken wrist in early 1934, just months before the auction. The injury was consistent with being grabbed forcefully by someone much larger. His own medical records show that Daniel was being neglected and possibly abused, Mrs. Sullivan said grimly. This completely changes our case strategy. Sam stared at the evidence of his son's suffering before coming to live with them. He had known Daniel was malnourished and traumatized, but seeing official documentation of abuse made him sick with anger and sadness. Why didn't this come up in the state investigation? Sam asked.
Because Morrison's attorney was careful to focus only on his current circumstances, Mrs. Attorney,
Sullivan explained, that in providing complete background documentation for the court, they've given us access to information that proves Morrison was an unfit parent when he lost custody of Daniel. Mrs. Sullivan's discovery required a complete revision of their legal strategy. Instead of simply arguing that Daniel was better off with the Martinez family, they could now demonstrate that returning him to his birth father would potentially place him back in an abusive situation. However, this strategy created a new dilemma for Sam and Maria. Using this evidence meant exposing Daniel to detailed testimony about the abuse he had suffered as a young child. The boy would have to relive traumatic memories and possibly testify about experiences he had worked hard to forget. Do we have to put Daniel through that? Maria asked when Mrs. Sullivan explained their options. Not necessarily, the lawyer replied. The medical records and police reports might be sufficient evidence on their own. But if Morrison's attorney challenges their relevance or argues that he's changed since then, we might need Daniel's testimony to establish the full picture. Sam and Maria faced an agonizing decision. They could protect Daniel from having to testify about his traumatic past, but doing so might cost them the case. Alternatively, they could use every tool available to win custody, but potentially traumatize their son in the process. They decided to let Daniel make the choice himself. Sitting down with him in their kitchen one evening, they explained the situation in terms a 10-year-old could understand. "Daniel," Sam said gently, "we've learned some things about why your life was so difficult before you came to live with us. We can use this information to help convince the judge that you should stay with us, but it might mean talking about painful memories." Daniel was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady with determination that surprised both adults.
"If it means I can stay here with you, I'll talk about anything," he said.
Those bad things happened to a different boy in a different life. I'm Daniel Martinez now, and I want to stay Daniel Martinez forever. The court hearing was scheduled for October 15, 1937. Exactly 3 years and 1 month after Daniel had been purchased at auction. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone involved in the case. The courthouse was packed with spectators, many of whom had followed Daniel's story from the beginning. Mrs. Patterson was there to testify about his academic progress. Dr. Harrison would speak about his medical care. Several neighbors had volunteered to provide character witnesses for the Martinez family. Thomas Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, looking nervous but determined. Sam was shocked by how much the man had changed in 3 years. Morrison appeared healthier and more prosperous than the desperate father who had surrendered his son at auction. His new wife, a pleasant-looking woman in her 30s, sat behind him in moral support. Judge William Crawford, the same man who had presided over the auction 3 years earlier, would hear the case. Sam found it fitting that the judge who had witnessed Daniel's transfer to their family would now determine his permanent future. Morrison's attorney presented his case first, emphasizing his client's reformed character, stable employment, and genuine desire to reunite with his son. Morrison testified about his regret over the circumstances that led to losing Daniel and his determination to provide a loving home now that his situation had improved. "I made mistakes," Morrison admitted under direct examination. "The depression hit us hard and I turned to drinking to cope with my failures as a husband and father. But I've been sober for 18 months now, I have steady work, and my wife and I can provide Daniel with everything he needs." Under cross-examination, Mrs. Sullivan methodically dismantled Morrison's claims of fitness. She presented the police reports, employment records, and medical documentation that painted a picture of chronic instability and neglect. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Cole, age Cole," Sullivan asked. "Were you intoxicated when your son broke his wrist in February 1934? Morrison's attorney objected, but Judge Crawford allowed the question. Morrison admitted that he had been drinking that day, but claimed the injury was accidental. "And were you intoxicated when you made the decision to put your son up for auction?" Mrs. Sullivan continued. Again, Morrison admitted to drinking but insisted that the auction had been a last resort to save Daniel's life, not a decision made while impaired. The most powerful testimony came